My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center here at Bard College. Welcome to the virtual reading group. Today, we are reading The Promise of Politics by Hannah Arendt. We are beginning now the long final fragment draft that comprises this book, which is sort of a mini book that Arendt wrote and never published called The Introduction to Politics. It begins with a very simple question. What is politics? And I know we talked a little bit about this last week as an introduction, but let me just remind ourselves. At its heart, politics for Hannah Arendt is about human plurality. As she says in the first line, politics is based on the fact of human plurality. What is plurality? Plurality means that all of us are, on the one hand, equal. That is, we share certain basic capacities to understand each other and recognize each other as human beings, and have a fundamental equality. And on the other hand, we are uniquely distinct and different. So the twofold characteristic of equality and distinction, as Arendt talks about in The Human Condition, is what the fact of human plurality is. And it is that equality which allows us to talk to each other, and yet our differences that make us distinct, that require us as human beings, as plural beings, to talk to each other. And in talking to each other and seeking to figure out how to live together as different, as absolutely different, and she wants to make this very clear, absolutely different human beings, we have to talk to each other and figure out how to live together. That's what politics is. For Hannah Arendt, politics is this activity of figuring out what we share and how we can live and associate together as absolutely distinct and different human beings. The second part of Introduction to Politics is called The Prejudice Against Politics and What, in fact, Politics is Today. So if politics is, right, if politics is this fact of human plurality and therefore the need of plural human beings to talk to each other and figure out what we share, there's a fundamental prejudice against politics. Now, in the last 100 pages of this book, we've read a number of essays where Arendt has talked to us about the prejudice that philosophers have had for a long time about politics, namely that politics doesn't pursue the truth, it pursues opinion or doxa because it's about plurality, and therefore they want to impose a truth on politics. And so there's a long-standing philosophical prejudice against politics. But that's not what she's talking about in this book or this essay, or however you want to call it, because it's a long essay. In this essay, she says that there are two sort of modern grounds for our prejudice against politics. One is fear. And it's the fear that, given this incredible plurality today in 2020, we might call it incredible polarization, right? But this plurality, in a world of nuclear bombs and internet worms and all sorts of other things, gives rise to a terrifying fear the fear that we might destroy ourselves, right? Either through nuclear annihilation or through some kind of computer AI, you know, um, taking over of the world, whatever your fear is. And so the fear is that if we leave it to politics, leave it to this plurality, leave it to human beings amidst their absolute differences to figure things out, we may all go to pot. And so that's a prejudice against politics. We want to get rid of politics because politics is scary. And the other reason we have, and so we want to replace politics with what? Well, with experts or Platonic philosopher king, or some kind of turn away from politics to history in the Marxian sense, so that we don't leave things to the chance of plural people, and we find historical rules and laws that we can govern things by. And so that's this modern fear. The other modern ground for a prejudice against politics is hope. It's the hope that we can replace politics with something like history or a world government, and a kind of expert, whether it's humanly expert run or computer driven expert run, kind of administrative or bureaucratic apparatus. And this hope, she says, that we would rid the world of politics through world government that transforms the state into an administrative machine and replaces armies with police. So, the idea that we get rid of politics and lead to a kind of technocratic government. This can be utopian in the sense that it won't happen, because it's very likely that the world government will not be benign, but will be tyrannical, even if it's an administrative, bureaucratic government. Or it can be dystopian if we understand that politics as freedom amongst plural people to build a world. If we understand politics as freedom, then a world government is dystopian, because it will eviscerate politics through a kind of top-down bureaucracy. And even mass democracies, she says, have this kind of dystopian disdain for politics as freedom, insofar as they disempower people through consumption and mass entertainment. So Amazon and Netflix would be the two, the two contemporary instantiations of how mass democracies disempower, and thus through the hope of a consumption-based and entertainment-based society, show a prejudice against politics. That was on 97, 98, of course, without mentioning Amazon or Netflix, written in 1950s. The real force, she says on page 99, the real force of the prejudice against politics today is the desire to relieve people of the ability and the need to act. It's the flight to impotence. So just to make it clear, right? So in the earlier parts of this book, The Promise of Politics, we've been talking about a philosophical prejudice against politics. In this book, in this long essay, the prejudice is, we've shifted our focus. We're no longer talking about philosophy or the history of philosophy or Marx or Montesquieu or Hegel or Socrates. This is a book that was meant for, us, regular citizens of the day. And it's not sort of talking about the historical and philosophical prejudice. It's talking about our prejudices. Clearly, there's a connection between the two, and we should be informed by it. And I think it's really wonderful that Jerry Cohen, the editor here, put all these books to get these essays and fragments together, because there is going to be some sort of philosophical ground for our contemporary prejudices against politics. but she's not framing it that way, and I think it's important for us to be aware of that. The next section of Introduction to Politics is called Prejudice and Judgment. Now, I'm going to talk about this, but let me say one or two things as a preliminary. First, this is one of the most important 10 pages of Arendt's work in my thinking, right? I find these to be incredibly rich and valuable pages. As far as I know, almost no Arendt scholar has taken them seriously. I don't know any major work on Arendt, not even sure I know of a minor work on Arendt, that takes these pages seriously. Now, here's the second thing I'm going to say. These pages can be incredibly controversial and provocative, and they may offend people, right? I mean, this is Hannah Arendt we're talking about. She likes to be provocative, not for the sake of provocation, but she says what she thinks. And these pages are going to, I think, cause some, pushback, and that's great. When I say that these are very important for my thinking, these pages, and that I really like them, it's not because I necessarily think they're right, although I think they're very insightful. It's because I think they raise some of the most important questions for us today. And so, I'm asking us all to take them seriously, intellectually. That doesn't mean take our feelings and emotions and exit them. We can certainly register those, but let's at least try and understand what she has to say, and then ask ourselves whether it's worthwhile understanding it, whether it's helpful. So with that somewhat maybe off-putting or challenging introduction, let me try and unpack what I take to be this 10 pages of the section Prejudice and Judgment. She begins with what I think is a commonplace and yet is nevertheless going to be controversial, which is that prejudices play a large role in our daily life, and we should not be upset about this. We shouldn't bemoan this. We are all prejudiced. It would be inhuman to not have prejudices. When I teach this, I ask my students to raise my hand and say, which one of you is prejudiced? And, most of them will raise their hand. And then when I pick on one and say, well, tell me some of your prejudices, they shut up. No one wants to talk about it, and for good reason, right? Because we have this idea that that prejudices are bad, that we're not supposed to have prejudices. And Arendt starts off and says, look, prejudices aren't so bad. Prejudices are part of what it means to be human. What would be really bad is if we didn't have prejudices, because then we wouldn't be human. Not only that, she says no one could live without prejudices, because if you were to live without prejudices, every time you met someone and every time you opened your door, you'd have to form an original judgment about, can I step on the ground? Can I, talk to this person? I mean, you'd have to form an original judgment about everything you do. And she says nobody could do that, right? It's just not possible. She then says politics is about dispelling and shedding light on prejudices. So now we have a second step. One, prejudices are human and unavoidable and necessary. And yet politics is about dispelling and shedding light on prejudices. All right. So what is a prejudice? She makes a distinction here between prejudice and judgment. And she's going to make then a further distinction between logical judgment and original judgment. But we'll get there. A prejudice, she says, are standard. This is on page 900. Prejudices are standards for judgment in everyday life, but they are not judgments themselves, right? They're standards for judgments in everyday life. They're what replaces judgment in everyday life so that we don't have to judge. So, for example, I mean, these are my examples, but I think they fit. The fact that the Holocaust happened, right, is a fact, and that it was bad is a prejudice. It's a prejudice that we share, and it's has a kind of authority. People say it. The Holocaust is bad. They say it all the time. So if you're a young student in the United States or in Europe or most of the world, you grow up and you go to school and you see videos and people say the Holocaust was bad, right? Slavery was bad. These are prejudices. And she says they're good. There's nothing wrong with prejudices, right? If every time a 10-year-old had to decide whether the Holocaust was bad or not, they had to go and read 10 books on the Holocaust, it would be a problem. And so we allow certain things to become prejudices. We encourage them to become prejudices because we want people to believe them without having to argue for them, as an appeal to an authority. And so these kind of prejudices then are not personal idiosyncrasies. They're not personal opinions. They're not based on my own experience or my own knowledge, right? They're things that I pick up in the ether, in the air. They're the Kool-Aid that I drink, to use the metaphor from my youth. So on the one hand, then, prejudices are like judgments in that they, like judgments, are social. They make claims about the world that are supposed to be believed by not just me, but by other people. And thus, prejudices are going to belong in what she calls the social realm as a substitute for judgment in the social realm. On the other hand, prejudices are unlike judgments because whereas judgments are attempts by me to woo you or persuade you of my opinion or my thinking, prejudices don't seek to persuade. They simply are an appeal to authority. They're not based on persuasion. And so this is going to be an important distinction as she builds up her argument between prejudices and judgment. The danger, she then goes and says that the danger of prejudices and the power of prejudices is that it comes from the fact that prejudices are rooted in the past. This is on page 101. Prejudices, thus, are previously formed judgments. So like our prejudice that the Holocaust was bad and slavery was bad, are based on judgments we made in the past, right? And that eventually have become so accepted that we don't need to justify them and argue for them or seek to persuade people of them. They just become things that are part of our prejudice, prejudgments. A prejudice is just a prejudgment, preduciere. It's a prejudgment that we don't have to actually make a judgment on. So that's the power of prejudice, is that it's so deeply in there, we don't even have to argue for it. It becomes the milk we drink. The danger of prejudice, he says, that it becomes so well anchored, and it's so well anchored in the past, that it actually precludes and makes impossible judgment and genuine experience, right? So if you have a prejudice like the Holocaust is bad, it makes it impossible for people to actually question it because it's unquestionable. It's a prejudice. And that can be good because you don't want to people have to question it all the time, but it can also be bad in that it stops us from thinking. And generally that's okay. You don't have to think about everything. We all are busy enough. We can't think about everything. But there are going to be times when prejudices, in that they preclude thinking and judgment and genuine experience, become dangerous. She then says that how do we dispel prejudice? Well, Remember, she said politics is the answer. Politics is how we shed light on and dispel prejudice. What she says is not going to work are enlightened orators or brochures or anti-racism webinars, right? Trying to tell people not to be prejudiced is never going to work. Something that I think we all have to consider. As I have on my other window on my computer, my anti-racism webinar that I have to take before the end of the year. She says that what we need to do to dispel prejudices is just discover the past judgments, namely that the Holocaust was bad or slavery was bad, just to take two, and reveal the truths in them. And sometimes those truths will be affirmed. But there are other prejudices, maybe that, slavery was good or the Holocaust was good, that we will have to take issue with. But it's only by getting back to the judgments and beyond the prejudices, back to the historical judgments and understanding why they were true at the time or seen as true at the time, and what has changed to make them not true anymore, that we can dispel prejudices, which means you can't simply say these things were never true, these things were always awful. Anyone who ever thought this time or that time was an anti-Semite or a racist. She said she doesn't think that's going to work, right? Again, you don't have to agree with her, but this is her argument about prejudices. The next part is where she talks about the difference between an original judgment and a syllogistic judgment. So I said before that she's distinguishing prejudices from judgments. There are two different kinds of judgments that come to us through philosophy and logic, right? One is a judgment based on the syllogism, that there's a rule, a major premise, there's a statement of fact or a minor premise, and there's a conclusion. And all judgments based on syllogisms are based on prejudices because they all start with a rule, and the rule comes from somewhere. It's a prejudice. And so the loss of standards in the modern world is a moral catastrophe when we think of judgments as based on syllogism, she says on page 102, I think. It's either 102. Well, I'll let you know. We're on 102. But there's another kind of judgment, which is original judgment, the judgment of taste, aesthetic judgment. And unlike a syllogistic judgment, which is logical and thus compulsory, a judgment of taste is never compulsory. It's always based on persuasion, but never persuasion through argument. I linked to a piece in Amor Mundi this week. Some of you may have read it yesterday. That was in Tablet Magazine by someone named, I think, was it Michael or Stephen Blake? I'm sorry, I should know that, but I had never heard of him before. But he wrote a very good essay. And in the essay, he talks about what an aesthetic judgment is. And he used, I thought, a very good example, right? We go to a museum, we walk over to a painting, and I sort of look at it and walk away. And then, Anita comes over to me and says, no, you should look at that again. Look at how they use the shadows, or look at the circurso, or look at, the perspective, or look at the colors, or look at the composition. And I say, I'm starting to see it. It's really wonderful. There's no compulsory logic that Anita has used to express to me why this painting is worth taking seriously and finding beautiful. But she's persuaded me, not through logic or compulsion or argument, but by, in Arendt's very Socratic and Kantian language, wooing me. She woos me to see what she sees. And that kind of wooing is the kind of persuasion that happens in aesthetic judgments of taste. And for Arendt, aesthetic judgments of taste are not only how we make judgments about artworks and paintings, but also how we make judgments about politics, right? So politics and art for Arendt, politics and culture for Arendt are both activities of the judgment of taste. So just like Anita woos me to her reading of the painting without argument, so can Stephen woo me to his argument about a stimulus payment, or his argument about abortion in politics. There's no right answer, just like there's no right answer about it being beautiful. There's no truth in politics, as we know Arendt says over and over again. But there is persuasion. There is wooing. And so this kind of judgment, free judgment of taste, is the kind of politics which Arendt is now going to distinguish from prejudice, right? And so that against prejudice, you have the politics of judgment based on persuasion and wooing. The last part of this chapter that I want to sort of focus on is where she begins to talk about what happens when prejudices break down. When prejudices break down, we have moments of historical crises, right? You could all imagine, I think, this without me going on and on about it, but the civil rights movement is a moment at which prejudices broke down and a kind of crisis emerges. And what happens? And Arendt says that when prejudices break down, and the authority that prejudices have therefore crumble, what usually happens is that prejudices are transformed into ideologies, right? And here's, I think, the part of this text that, again, I find very compelling and yet also is very controversial. And I just want to point it out in its controversy. So she's going to say that, so for example, right, in his book, Stamped from the Beginning, Ibram Kendi makes an argument that racism has nothing to do with hatred of blacks, right? He says that racism emerged not out of any kind of prejudice or hatred of blacks. He says racism emerged out of a need to justify the material supremacy and the material privileges and benefits of a system of slavery after the prejudices against blacks had begun to crumble. Does that make, I hope that's clear. And so he says that racism is our system of justification. That is actually an argument that is exactly Arendt's argument, both in this essay and in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. What Arendt argues is that it is when prejudices crumble at times of crisis in which we need, what people do in order to justify their privileges and their supremacy that were based on those prejudices, they turn the prejudices into pseudo theories or ideologies. And the difference is that a prejudice is an authority that doesn't need justification. It spares the individual from judgment, from encountering reality, but it's always partial in nature. You had a prejudice against Jews, what she calls Jew hatred, but it didn't lead to, it was just a prejudice. It said we don't like Jews, but it didn't lead to we have to kill all Jews. It was only when the prejudice against Jews crumbles to some degree, and it has to be used as a justification that therefore Jews have to be killed or eliminated. And that's when prejudice turns into racism. And so Arendt makes this distinction between ideological racism and, historically hardened over judgments in prejudice. And so she wants to say, and in a way, by the way, I think that is exactly the same argument that Ibram Kendi and others make, that racism and anti-Semitism are not prejudices, they're racisms, they're ideologies. And politics, she says, is about dispelling prejudices. Ideologies are deeply anti-political in that they seek to totalize a world, and just like prejudices do, but in a much more coherent and successful way, inoculate us against reality. I think I'll end there. The last section we were reading today is what is the meaning of politics, which she says is freedom. And we can come back to that in Q&A if people are interested in it. But I've already talked for a little longer than I usually do. I just thought this was a very complicated and difficult and controversial series of pages that we read for today. So I wanted to lay it out as carefully as I could. So as those of you know, we have two ways to ask questions. The main way, and again, I know some people would like me to read more of the chat. It's just hard for me to do so. What I would say is I'm going to focus on the hands raised, but I'll try and pay attention to the chat as well. And if there's things you want me to talk about, maybe someone can let me know. All right, James, you're up first. You got to unmute yourself.
Thank you. This was the most delicious.
James, you're not. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
No, I still can't hear you.
Oh, I can hear him.
All right. While James figures that out, how about Tara?
Is that it?
James, I can't hear you. I don't know what's going on.
Okay.
Is it me? Can other people hear James?
Yeah, I can hear James.
Oh, it was me. I'm sorry. Go ahead, James. I'm sorry.
This was the most delicious chunk of reading that I've experienced here. It had God, it had soup, it had miracles, it had the Fox News device for the Fox News device for non-attributing things to people. People say, people think. Is this where Fox News got that concept? She says it on the bottom of page 102. But the most fascinating thing for me was on page 106. Her description of when human beings come together, be it publicly or politically, a space is generated that simultaneously gathers them into it and separates them from one another. Each such space has its own structure that changes over time and reveals itself in a private context as custom, in a social context as convention, and in public content as laws, constitutions, statutes, and the like. Whenever people come together, the world thrusts itself in between them, and it is this in-between space that all human affairs are conducted. That just I had about 5 paintings come out of that.
Yeah. So thanks, James. It's on page 106. I see in the chat some people, who use Kindle don't find it. It's going to be it's in the section on prejudice, on prejudice and judgment, near the end of that section, about 2 pages before the section, what is the meaning of politics? And it's right before the paragraph that begins the space between men. All right. So the first thing to understand and think about here is that politics is based in the fact of plurality, right? As we said earlier. And as politics is based on the fact of plurality, it is where people who are the same and different meet and begin to talk and act in a way that they can begin to build and form a world. And so politics depends upon this space in which not man, but men come together. And politics is the in-between. It's what happens in between men in this discourse between people. And this, but there's not only politics that are, and I think some people have noticed this in Arendt's writing, but she's a very spatial thinker. And she talks about the spaces of freedom at the end of On Revolution. And here she talks, and other places in the Human Condition as well, she talks about the spaces of politics. But here what she says is and James is pointing it out to us, and this spaces that we enter into and live amongst each other within are called a world. And she says wherever human beings come together, be it private or socially or politically, there's a space generated that gathers them into it. So in a private space, right? She says every space has its own structure that changes over time and reveals itself in a private context as custom. So in our house or amongst our church or our temple or our mosque or whatever it is, we have private household gods. We have private customs that are either familial or maybe kinship based, and these customs and habits of the home, very much define how we interact. In a social basis where prejudices matter, there are conventions, again, habits, but more socially. So it doesn't have to be, within my mosque or my temple or my home gods, but it could be in a chess club. And there's conventions about how we decide who goes first or who plays white or who plays black. And these are, and whether we shake hands or not. And these are sort of more social conventions about how people interact in a common space. And then in a public space, in a public context, the space are the laws, constitutions, and statutes, which she'll call in other places the hedges, in the sense of bushes, the hedges around an agora or a public space that define the public space and provide a space for us to encounter each other in public. And so those are the spaces, and politics is about being in that space, and that space is a world. She says the space between men, this is the next sentence in the next paragraph, the space between men, which is the world, cannot of course exist without them. So you need men, and a world without human beings would be a contradiction in terms, but this does not mean that the world and the catastrophes that occur in it should be regarded as purely human occurrences. So the world we live in, right, that we encounter each other in, where we have laws and statutes and constitutions, also conventions and customs. That world is not only, while humans are in it and humans matter in it, it's not purely human. It's also a world beyond human, and we are conditioned by that world, and that's going to be a big part of our argument in the human condition. So, for example, she says, when an asteroid comes and decimates the world, and dinosaurs die, right? That's a catastrophe. She talks about on page 107 in that same paragraph. That completely transforms the world and the conditions of being human in that world. A nuclear war, she says, if any life were left after it, could be completely changed what it means to be human in a world after a nuclear war. We're going to read the human condition next, and the argument of the human condition is that in the modern age, an event has happened, namely the rise of science, that is radically transforming the human world, and we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be human in the modern age, amongst the rise of modern science, and how does that change what it means to be human? So these are ways in which this space of the world conditions us humans, and in which we live in that space, and politics is what happens in that space.
Is the space? Is it possible that the space absolutely transforms the men and the society and the culture that is in it?
It's possible.
Can happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I just said. I mean,
yeah,
if we were to have a nuclear war and the space of how and where one lives is utterly transformed, one could imagine conditions emerging such that human life changes and what it means to be human changes. She asks the question in her book, The Human Condition, at the end, and also in her essay, The Conquest of Space, if humans, were to launch onto a spaceship and live on a spaceship for generations and generations, and on that spaceship, everything that they have, the air they breathe, the food they eat, the water they drink, the bed, the floor, whatever they have is created by humans, and they live in a fully fabricated world where nothing is left to chance, and even reproduction becomes something done through genetic manipulation and taking eggs and fertilizing them and things like that to provide people who are the right kind of people to survive in this spaceship society. She says they'd still be human, but the very nature of what human be, but they still have human nature. But what human means in such a differently conditioned world would be different. I see Jerry Cohen wants to jump in. So Jerry, I'm going to let you jump in and chime in here.
Thank you, Roger. But I want to ask you first, because I wasn't able to tune in the beginning. If you've already discussed this, it was at the very beginning of today's reading, the second paragraph, actually, on page 93. What is remarkable among all great thinkers is the difference in rank between their political philosophies and the rest of their works. Did you discuss that?
Not last week. We sort of talked a little bit about it, but not this week. But go ahead.
Well,
by the way, this is Jerry Cohen, who edited this book, everyone. So welcome, Jerry.
Hello, everyone. This is my time is such that I cannot spend as much time with your wonderful sessions as I would like. However, this paragraph has struck me for many years when I put this book together. Since then, she's talking about political philosophers, including Plato. Their politics never reaches the same depth. This lack of depth is nothing but a failure to sense the depths in which politics is anchored. I think that this is a tremendously important statement, particularly as it follows the discussion of Marx as the end of political philosophy. So in that context, I mean, you could say, is Hobbes' Leviathan a second-rate work? That is not the point. Hobbes himself senses the end of the Leviathan. He will now return to universal truths, which are welcome to all men, something like that. After writing Leviathan, my interest in this, Roger, is to know what people think about her saying that politics is of less importance in philosophy than other natural philosophy, if you will, the whole, let's say, metaphysics, physics. I mean, if you think of Aristotle's oeuvre, practically everything is mentioned there.
Right.
And of course, he wrote a politics too, but that this would, according to Arendt, as in Plato's Republic, be secondary of importance to them. Now, that is considering what you are doing so admirably, Roger, and this virtual classroom. What do you make of that? What do you make of it? To me, it's a very serious statement.
Yeah, I think it's very serious, and you know, I mean, the whole 90 pages of the book prior to this, right, are about the prejudice of the philosophers against politics, right?
Against politics as she conceives it.
As she conceives it.
Yeah.
And so, you know, here on 2 pages after, so Jerry's talking about, you know, the second page of the whole essay. 2 pages after that, she says there are 2 good reasons why philosophy has never found a place where politics can take shape, right? Mm-hmm. And one of those reasons, she says, is that philosophy considers man in the singular, not men, and not the spaces in between, which is what we were just talking about. And because philosophy has always asked, who is man, right? Who am I? What is it? Who am I? Where do I come from? And where am I going? In the traditional Platonic questions. From Arendt's point of view, it has not asked, who are we? And it hasn't asked, what is the space in which we are? And so, but she does say Hobbes understood this. Hobbes understood that politics is about the we, the space between men. She says right here on page 95.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. She says a lot about Hobbes here and elsewhere.
Well, I think Hobbes, she thinks of Hobbes as a political philosopher, not as a philosopher who also has a politics. And I think that's a big difference. I think Hobbes is an exception for her he doesn't count in that tradition.
Well, if you read the end of Leviathan, I don't think so. If you read the end of Leviathan, he says explicitly, now I want to turn to serious things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But so, I mean, he was a thinker of politics.
I think it's worth pondering, actually.
Yeah. Thanks, Jerry. No, and then the second reason is that man is always seen as an image of God, and therefore as singular and in God's image. And then the third reason, which relates to the earlier texts as well, is that we're so afraid of plurality and the danger of plurality in politics that we substitute plurality with history, and turn man into in the Hegelian and Marxian context simply a manifestation.
I think all of that is very true, what you're saying, and important, Roger. But there's something else that I think needs to be questioned, and that is, maybe not today, but as a general question to reflect on, is it true that to these philosophers, politics was really so inimical that they had to, well, you get that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, you know, I mean, we spend a lot of time trying to understand Arendt, and then we sort of have to ask the question of, well, is it right? You know, is it right that all these philosophers didn't consider politics? You know, and on the one hand, obviously it's not. I mean, Arendt takes so much of her politics from Aristotle, and to think that, you know, she could, I mean, the very idea of politics as she calls it here, the association of different men, is a retranslation of Aristotle, where he says that politics is the unity of a multitude. And so if you read Aristotle on the unity of a multitude in his book, The Politics, it's exactly what she says. It's coexistence and association of different men on page 93, the first page of this essay. So obviously it's a gespitzt, it's an intensified claim, as are many of Arendt's claims, because, you know, when she says that you know, Plato is anti-politics, I mean, of course there's a way in which that's true and there's a way in which it's not true. She's trying to make a general point, which is that you know, insofar as philosophers have sought the truth and sought to impose standards, they go against the spirit of politics, which is plurality and dissensus and doxa and opinion. But I think you're right. I mean, she's clearly, you know, speaking in broad strokes that I think she would easily be the first to admit that if you looked, you could find moments of political thinking in all these folks.
Roger,
Thanks, Jerry.
May I say hello to Professor Kohn? Professor Kohn, it's an honor to have you among us.
Oh, no, it's an honor for me to be here. Thank you.
We are so happy to have you, and congratulations for your introduction to this book. It's great. Your introduction is really great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Clara. We're going to go through, Tara, you're next. I just want to make sure we try and get through some of these. We got a lot of questions coming up. Oh my God, yeah.
Thank you. And yes, thank you to Professor Kohn for being here. My question has to do with the bottom of page 100. And
okay, just let me say that's in the second section. No, it's in the third section. It's in the second section, right after the subsection Prejudice and Judgment, for those who are in Kindles. So I apologize, you know, I'm trying to be helpful to people using different paginations.
Great. And the question is sort of generally outlined around a question I posted in the chat about what is the relationship between Arendt's idea of prejudice and her idea of common sense, and are they synonyms, or are they part of one another? And then I was really struck in this section on 100 when she says, it's about a third down, what it shares with judgment is the way in which people recognize themselves and their commonality, so that someone caught up in prejudices can always be certain of having an effect on others, whereas what is idiosyncratic can hardly ever prevail in the public and political sphere and has an effect only in the intimacy of the private. I was really also interested in, I was surprised by her treatment of the idiosyncratic and relegating it to the private only, because I would think of idiosyncrasy as being related to action or difference. So I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about the connection between some of those, particularly the idiosyncrasy ends up in the private sphere.
Thanks, Tara. It's a big and really good questions. And it's going to make me sort of stop and think for a second. So the question, the first, there's two related questions, as I understand it, that Tara is asking as I try and figure out an answer to them, which is that one is the relation between prejudice and common sense, right? And I have to say that's a very important and profound question. And I'm not sure I have a good answer for it. And the second is the role of personal idiosyncrasy. So the role of personal idiosyncrasy, right? When she says prejudices are not personal idiosyncrasies, which she says, and personal idiosyncrasies are immune to proof. as are prejudices, right? But have a basis in personal experience. So, you know, if I meet someone with blue eyes and they, you know, treat me awfully, and I think of blue-eyed devils, right? You know, that's an idiosyncrasy. It's not going to have much of a claim outside of my own small realm. A prejudice, which also is not based in proof or anything like that, right, is one that is rooted in a kind of historical judgment that has a wider ambit, and has, you know, and this is the part of this controversial part, has a kind of truth to it, or at least had a kind of truth to it at one point. You know, the truth may have been extended and it may become a stereotype, etc., but it was grounded in something that people saw and believed, right? Jews were exempted from laws on usury and therefore did deal with money, and therefore people saw them as greedy. Now, that doesn't mean Jews are greedy, but there was a historical fact and history to that, and you can't simply fight it by simply saying don't say it, you know, and it's very wrong to say it. You have to go back and explain the history. That's her point, right? And that's politics. That's what you're on. So if prejudice is not a personal idiosyncrasy, but is part of a world and part of authority that they say, right? What's the relation between prejudice and common sense? I think that's a really important question. And so on one level, Arendt uses the word common sense in a very Arendtian way, which is common sense is sort of like a sixth sense, she says, that ties the other senses together. And that's not what prejudice is, right? That's not what we're talking about here. But we do talk about, she talks a lot about a shared world or a common world, right? And what does it mean to share certain facts? And for example, you know, is the fact that the Holocaust was bad a fact or a prejudice, right? Or is it a part of our common heritage, right? It's not a fact in the sense that you can have a fact bad or good, right? It's an opinion. But she would say that it's part of the common world we live in, and in that sense, I think there is a way that sort of basic prejudices are part of our common world, and thus our common sense in that sense, the ground we walk on and the sky above us. Historical crises come about when those prejudices crumble, and we need to remake the ground below us and the ground above us in some way. And those are those kind of historical crises. So I think that there is a way in which, you know, her discussion of prejudice is in a way a discussion of that kind of common sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, which is challenging to a lot of us, I think, right? As I said, this is a challenging section. I think one of the most controversial and provocative and I think brilliant sections of writing I've read of Arendt's, but really challenging. Inji?
Sorry, I was not prepared for that. So about the transition from 107 to 108, so she talks about, I think, 107, she talks about the importance.
Just so we know, this is the paragraph beginning "one can, of course." Yes? Or not?
Yes, one can, of course. Yeah, that one. So 107 to 108, just before the meaning, what is the meaning of politics? So I think just before that paragraph, she kind of talked about the importance of the word and how the world is beyond individuals and the limits of academic work that only looks at the interior of individuals. But then then from that paragraph, she kind of talks about like a facile objection that the world is obviously composed of man and there's an element of human agency, etc. So, and then she talks about Plato and Pericles, and I don't think I understand this reference because I don't know philosophy that much. So, what is it that she tries to caution or flag by talking about this Plato anecdote?
All right. So at its core, so she says these abilities do indeed belong to the nature of man, human productivity and action. If they prove inadequate, must we not then change the nature of man before we can think about changing the world? At its core, this is an ancient objection and can appeal to the very best of all witnesses, to Plato, who reproached Pericles for having left the Athenians no better off after his death than they were before. Well, I mean, the general context of this is that we can't expect men to change the world. The world is bigger than any one man. And it is the world of men. It's the world of human productivity and human action. And they do not, and while the nature of man is that they can act and they can change, you know, you can't really, because man is conditioned by the world, you can't change man unless you change the world, right? We talked about this earlier, like the world, you know, is the world being changed by the rise of modern science? It may be, but you can't make man simply a product of scientific laws like Marx or Darwin wanted to, until the world is fully scientized and changed. And so, you know, there are limits to what man can do to change his world, because you can't just change. She says, must we not then change the nature of man before we can think about changing the world? At its core, it's an ancient objection. The Plato-Pericles thing, I think, is that Pericles led the Athenians against the Spartans, and in the end, while he did many great things, they didn't end up any better off after the war. I'm not sure I know enough to answer this fully. Does anyone else want to give it a shot?
I missed the actual question.
Well, question is sort of, what is this example about Plato and Pericles doing? I think it's simply that, you know, Plato reproached Pericles for having left the Athenians no better off. And yet, what was Pericles to do, right? I mean, you know, at some point we have a limited impact. We would have to change the nature of men and the world in order to really make things better off. I think that's the point. I have to admit, it's a little bit dark to me there.
I would say something. I would say just one thing. And that is, I think this would be an example of Plato not taking politics terribly seriously.
I think that's fair. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I guess I was just wondering whether she talked about the importance of the overwhelming effects of the word, so that we can't just dissect the problem only looking at the interior of the human, but at the same time, and then she always talks about the importance of changing humans. So I guess I was just confused between this tension between the importance of word versus the agency of man.
Yeah, I think what she's saying is that men can't really change the world, right? The world is bigger than man. The world is where men come together and act, but that world is bigger than they are, except for things like that are world destroying, right? Like asteroids or nuclear war, or maybe the rise of modern science. Then you have things that happen that destroy the world and change the world, but those are beyond the acts of one man.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Fran,
Hi, thank you.
in her swan song. Go ahead, Fran.
This essay made me curious about Hannah Arendt's use of the words man and human.
Yeah.
When is she using man? When is she using human? She starts out this essay being very particular about man in the singular and man in plural and the implications of that. And that is mainly when she talks about, I guess, politics. And then on page 95, when she talks about history.
Which is 3 pages into the essay for those who want to know. Yeah.
She switches using human.
Yeah.
And I made a little experiment and I want to first read the sentence. In the idea of world history, the multiplicity of man is melted into one human individual, which is then also called humanity. This is the source of a monstrous and inhumane aspect of history, which is further. If I ask this word human with man, then the sentence reads like this. In the idea of world history, the multiplicity of man is melted into one man, which is then also called mankind. This is the source of a monstrous and unmanly aspect of history. After I did this, I looked up in the dictionary the word unmanly, and it says like that is weak or cowardly.
Mm-hmm.
Then I look up the word inhuman, and that says like it's lacking of human qualities, it's without compassion, cruel, and barbaric. So now my question is like, why is she, when she's switching from politics to history, these words? And can I say that there's less risk involved in being a man than being a human? Because if you fail, if you become inhuman, it's barbaric and cruel. But if you become unmanly, you know, that's just weak and cowardly. That's not like a big disaster.
Yeah. So, this is a somewhat complicated part of Arendt, and it's not just Arendt, but you know, she belongs to this part of philosophy, this tradition of philosophy. Man, in English, der Mann, yeah, or der Mensch.
No, I don't think, not only the man, or is it after Mensch?
Yeah. Der Mann, in German and in other languages, is for Arendt not a gendered idea. So she uses man as universal to mean man and woman, but she doesn't use the word human. And you know why? She thinks that human is dehumanizing in an important way. When she talks about the rise of human rights, what she says is that when we ask what is, you know, when we ask about human rights, we sort of strip everything away from man as men and women and others, and reduce it to like bare life in what Giorgio Agamben would call bare life. And that when we do that, there's not much manly or mankind left of it. And so for Arendt, when she's talking about man, she's talking about men, women, and others in contemporary gender politics. When she talks about human on page 95 in the paragraph beginning the West's solution, she says in the idea of world history, the multiplicity of men, that's men and women, right, is melted into one human individual. Therefore, an individual stripped of particularities and characteristics. And for her, that is inhuman in its stripping of characteristics, including gender and sex. And so she really resists the word human or, menschenrecht or things of that sort. And, this is a big problem in contemporary publishing about Arendt, because I've had numerous discussions with publishers who insist that all references to man be replaced with human. And I've largely given in recently, although at first I didn't, but it's not right in Arendt's language. And it does take away an important aspect of her thought, which I think a lot of people don't agree with, but is part of her thought. And so you're right to bring it up, but she definitely means something different by them.
I kind of
You're breaking up.
Abstract. Oh,
turn your video off so I get a better stream. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I understand that the term man is like very abstracted, and that is maybe like something, as she says, like on page, I think like 106, in politics, human produce what they themselves are not, that is things. So I kind of like think about this term man as these things that people produce in politics, right? But then my question still remains, why does she use man when she talks about politics? And why does she use humans or humankind or humanity when she talks about history?
Because history is following laws that reduce all men to humans, whereas politics is about plural and distinct individuals, men and women and others, and not that are all miracles and all new and all unique and don't follow historical laws.
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can try. History is a science, and as a science, it says that all humans follow and act according to knowable and discoverable historical laws. It takes away their freedom, their spontaneity, their capacity of being miracle workers. And so it reduces them to a kind of undifferentiated humanity. Whereas man for her, especially men for her, represents the plurality of being a distinct person in each case. Obviously, the politics of language today works differently than it did 60 years ago. But that's how she understood it. And the question today, I think, for a lot of us is how to make that distinction visible without using words that today are considered to be almost the opposite of how she meant them to be.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yep. Alex?
Hi, Roger, everybody. Is this
Hi.
coming? Great. Yeah. Thanks for the meeting today. I guess I want to raise a question. I guess a kind of a critical question. I imagine this is probably often raised about Hannah Arendt, and it has to do with this alignment of politics and aesthetics, which I think is connected with what the claim, Roger, that you mentioned earlier, Arendt's claim that there is no truth in politics. So I guess even thinking about somebody like Kant, who comes up with this aesthetic theory, of a certain kind of freedom that we have in making aesthetic judgments without an explicit criterion that are reflective rather than determining. But Kant would have never, though, extended this model to politics, I don't think, right? And I think the reason for that is this kind of, I guess we can call the philosophical claim that there is a distinction between truth and appearance, or reality and appearance. And, so I think we see versions of that throughout this tradition that Arendt is challenging, right? We see something like that in Plato. Marx has his own materialist version. I think Kant would have had his own version around, maybe ideas or laws that should govern something like political action. And I guess my question is, isn't there a worry? I mean, I guess I have this worry that if we align politics and aesthetics in this way, then, that threatens to, it opens the door to, ideologies. It opens the door to manipulation, to all these things, I think, that philosophers basically identify. And I guess what I see in Arendt as maybe an answer to this is something like a move towards a political theology, with her discussion of the miracle and, this kind of, it's almost like there's a messianic element, and almost like a kind of faith, not a faith in a transcendent, being, but something like a faith in politics. And I guess my worry is that enough to hang political life on? And isn't there a need for something like a criterion, something like a law or a principle? So, Kant was very explicit about this. His vision of political life is bound by the rules of right? So I understand Arendt is coming from the phenomenological tradition, where, appearance is taken very seriously. And I wonder if that may be a problem politically.
Thank you, Alex. It's a really great question and thought. Very briefly on the sort of technical part of your question about Kant, whether Kant's critique of judgment is political or not is an interesting question. I don't want to get too far into it. Clearly, on one level, it's not. It's a critique of taste, and yet, if you do read the second critique, his critique of practical judgment, which is his more political philosophy, the finding of freedom is an aesthetic is an aesthetic judgment. One that's non-empirical, a non-empirical finding of freedom, the idea of freedom. And thus, it does have a role in his politics. But as does, by the way, in the end, the idea of reason, and thus what the law is, because there's no criteria for the law. There's no, in the end, it's simply the law is what is rational. So I think that there is a way, even a Kantian accepted way, to see a really strong and important foundational relation between the critique of judgment and the critique of practical reason. But let's leave that aside for now. To the bigger and more important and really thoughtful question that you ask, which is that don't we need standards in politics? I think the answer has to be yes, and I don't think Arendt disagrees with that. The difference, I think, where I think the question that you're raising is, where do the standards come from, right? Do the standards come from political science? Do they come from scientists? Do they come from experts? Do they come from laws of history? Are they criteria in a kind of identifiable certain way that are universal and last? Or are they original, genuine judgments, aesthetic judgments of taste that over time get solidified into custom, context, and principles of legality, and become part of the ground we stand on in the sky above us, and thus become, who asked the question about common sense and prejudice? It was a good question, but come back to this question of common sense, Tara, I think, right? They become part of our common sense and become in some way prejudices. And they can at times be crumbled. They can crumble, and at times we have to dispel them because they become out of date. But the standards are not expert standards. They're not driven through scientific or philosophical knowledge. They're driven through collective judgments and the aesthetic approval that those judgments get over generations. And so I don't think, all of which is to say, I think you're right to say we need standards, and I don't think Arendt disagrees with you. I think it's just a question of where the standards come from and what is the sort of foundation or content of those standards. Does that make sense as an answer to your question, whether you agree with it or not?
Yeah, I think it does. If I understand what you're saying, it seems that so for her, the standard would kind of emerge in this political activity of acting freely together, and communication would probably be a big part of it, and acting together. I guess where I see the sort of the issue is that the origin of these standards is somehow aesthetic, and I'm not sure if there is a because you could say, sure, something begins as aesthetic, or we experience it first in our aesthetic lives, but actually there are principles and there are certain truths.
Alex, we're sort of short on time, so let me try and answer it this way. I'm going to give a second answer because I think it's a great question. I think one of the things that we all are pretty aware of today is the decline and shattering of standards and today, right? And Arendt was already aware of that 50 or 60 years ago. In the 1960s, in a number of things she reads and speaks, many of which I first encountered when we read together Jerry Cohn's edited volume, Thinking Without Banisters. There's a number of places it appears in that text. Arendt repeats this phrase, which clearly came to mean a lot to her in the 1960s, which I've talked about with this group a number of times, that talking about justice and piety makes the world more just and more pious. And what she means by that is that at a time in which the standards and criteria of judgment are really lost, and authorities and prejudices are in question, and we're in a time of the crumbling of lots of prejudices. How do you rebuild them, right? Well, one idea is, you go back to the Bible, or you create a new Bible, or you develop catechisms, or you develop new sciences of how you behave and things like that. And you teach people social science, and you try and get social scientists to figure it out. Her view is different. You put people together in a space of politics, and you let them talk about justice and piety. And they'll disagree, but they'll find some things they agree on. And over time, as they build on those agreements, those will become new standards, and those will become new criteria. And then after another generation, when they get together and they're building on those, they'll find new standards and new judgments, and they'll build on those. And over time, we'll build a new common world, a new common sense. But it's going to take a long time. And, in her view, that's politics. And this effort to sort of short circuit it with philosophy is not only destined to fail, but is for her anti-political. So that's why I'm really interested in this question of citizen assemblies, right? So Tocqueville, in his book Democracy in America, says that the most important institution in the American Constitution and American government is the jury. And he says the jury is so important because in the process of bringing 12 people together to talk about justice, that's where everyday Americans basically reaffirm and learn and make their standards, their criteria, over against the lawyers, right? And the problem that Arendt says in the US Constitution is that it didn't leave a political space like that, where everyday people would come and talk, what Jefferson called the ward system. And so this is why the Arendt Center and I am very interested in these new idea called citizen assemblies or citizen juries, which we have this webinar on, and we're having a big conference on coming up in April, because, it's in those encounters where you bring 150 people together for a couple of weeks to talk about gun control or abortion or immigration or whatever the issue is, that people begin to find where they agree. And that's the building of new standards. And I think that's what Arendt is really interested in. So I hope that's helpful, Alex. We can talk about it more. We're sort of out of time, so I want to get to a couple more questions. John Stern.
Yeah, my question sort of, or my thoughts sort of evolve from exactly what we're talking about, and to try and bring it to shorten it. Are we talking about that for Arendt, if you come into a public space, that's good, and I can bring my prejudice, but I corrupt that space when I bring my ideology into it?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great question. So let me for Arendt, as she said, prejudices belong in the social sphere, right? They belong in a chess club where we let in chess players, and they belong in a Jewish resort where we let in Jews, and they belong in a Christian resort where we let in Christians. And in that sense, prejudices form part of our social world. Now, on the political world, right, it's going to be a little different, because in politics, at least for her, the core of politics is that everyone is equal. And so if you have prejudices that exist in the private or social sphere, when you enter the political sphere, you have to treat people as equal citizens. And so those prejudices are not welcome and not permitted in the political or public sphere. Obviously, that is easier to say in theory than in practice, right? And our political sphere and any political sphere is going to be infused with prejudices. Arendt is aware of that, but what she says is that politics is the effort to dispel those prejudices. It's a never-ending effort because we're always going to have prejudices that we carry with us. But I think you could amend it and say politics is the effort, the unending effort, to dispel those prejudices that are most prejudicial to equal treatment in any society. But I think you're right. When you enter the public sphere, ideally, you're supposed to enter it as free from prejudices as you can. Obviously, that's never going to happen.
Well, I was under the impression that one could bring into the political realm a prejudice.
You can, you have to. You're never going to avoid it. But
if I turn it into an ideology without thought, then I've corrupted the space.
Okay. Certainly, if you bring it into an ideology, you've corrupted the space. But I think so. I mean, that I fundamentally agree with, right? And she would as well. And race or anti-Semitism or racism or any other ideology legally corrupts the space. But I think even when you bring your social prejudices and private prejudices into politics, depending on what they are, you corrupt the space. Some prejudices, my prejudice for kombucha, which all of you are aware of because you see me drinking it every week, does not corrupt the political space, or at least not in ways that most of us are aware of. 10 years ago, my using the word woman and man would not have thought to corrupt the political space, although now people would say that it does. The point is that the political space is supposed to treat us all as citizens, as equal. And there are certain prejudices that don't impact how we treat each other as citizens. And of course, I bring them into the public sphere with me. But as we become aware of prejudices that do impact the equality of the public sphere, we have to work to dispel those. I think that's her point. Because even though they're not ideologies or racisms, they can, in the political sphere, they can, it's one thing if I'm racist against Jews, right? Then I think they should be killed or, not even allowed to vote. But if I'm prejudiced against Jews, can I bring that prejudice into the public sphere? It's an interesting question. So let me rethink it, John. The answer is to some degree, yes. I can't avoid it, right? I bring that prejudice in. But for her, it's a partial thought. It's not a full thought. It doesn't mean that I want to get rid of Jews. It means I just don't like them. And so I can bring it in with me. It's who I am. And I can, act as a citizen on it. What I can't do is refuse to talk to Jews in politics, because then I'm not treating them equally. So it depends. And this is maybe the distinction between race and prejudice, but it depends how strong and the way that prejudice works. I can bring in my prejudice against blue-eyed people into politics as long as I still work with and talk to and respect blue-eyed people in politics. But I can't, if I refuse to allow them to serve in Congress or refuse to talk to them, then I'm violating my obligation as a citizen, I think, for her. So I guess it would depend on on, you can bring your prejudice in, but the question is what you do with your prejudice. Does that make sense? Maybe.
Yeah. Thank you.
You know, like she'll say, she'll say she'll say that it's okay as a business owner to not serve Jews because but only if your business is not on the public main street or thoroughfare. If your business is on the main street or in a business district, then you have to serve everybody because everyone should have the right to be treated as an equal person in public. Right? So if you think about this case that was with the baker who wouldn't make a wedding cake for a gay couple in Colorado a couple of years ago, from an Arendtian point of view, I mean, they had a store and they served anyone in the store, whether they were straight or gay, but they also had a custom cake business and they said, we only will do that for straight couples. And from an Arendtian point of view, that might be allowable.
But isn't the side street just as important as the main street?
Well, I mean, that's, then we get into questions of degree, right? If they run the cake business out of their store, even though it's not on the street, is it, but if someone runs it in a house, right, that's not in a business district, I think you have a better case from an Arendtian point of view. I mean, it's a complicated one, and I don't know. All I can tell you is I think these are questions she raises. I don't think they're fully answered. At least you have to think them through.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. I know we're out of time. If people need to go, I completely understand it, and thank you. And remember, we're not meeting for a couple of weeks. We'll be back on January 8th. So thank you all very much. But I'll take the last two questions from Andrew and Hal if they still are here.
Yeah, thanks for taking my question. As a preface, I would just make the comment that it seems to me possible that genuine judgments and prejudices look the same from the outside, and I'd be really interested in finding out if you agree with that. I guess I had a series of thoughts that started as I was struggling with the specific examples being used here, and I guess one thing that I would pull from the text is on page 100.
All right, that's in the section Prejudice and Judgment, the second page.
Yeah. So obviously this justification of prejudice as a standard for judgment in everyday life has its limits. It indeed applies only to genuine prejudices, that is, to those that do not claim to be judgments. And that you can tell that genuine prejudices are normally recognized by their unabashed appeal to the authority of they say or the opinion is. So I think for me, that was like a healthy definition of prejudice. And so in the case, so I was struggling with these very specific examples and struggling with categorizing them next to other examples. And it seems to me that things like the Holocaust is bad or slavery is bad, these things are very difficult to put in the tone, if you will, in the mode of a trusting prejudice. And that's what I'm trying to get at, this element of positive social.
You mean a genuine prejudice?
Yeah. So a genuine prejudice. And so that has led me, sorry, I'm trying to shorten it up now, but that has led me to suspect that these belong to a whole category of things, and this is what I want your opinion on, which cannot exist as healthy prejudices. They can only exist as bad prejudices or as authentic judgments. And there are reasons for that we probably don't have time to go into. But like it's about that mode.
Like what could only exist as a healthy judgment and not as a genuine prejudice? The Holocaust is bad?
Yes. Yeah, that's part of that category because.
Well, okay, but if we say the Holocaust, let me just ask so I understand it, Andrew. If I say the Holocaust is bad, it's not a bad prejudice, right? I mean, I think most of us agree with it, if I understand it. And secondly, it's not a judgment for most of us because most of us haven't done. I mean, at least, okay, many of us here have, so it's an unfair thing, but I think for a lot, if you're teaching this to young kids, you largely say, Holocaust happened, here's what it is, it's bad. You don't like make them sit around and, read pro and cons and make a judgment on it.
Yeah.
So
could I try to clarify real quick?
Yeah, so clarify. I just want to understand your question. Okay,
I'm going to try to come up with the reasons why I say it can exist as a healthy prejudice. It can only exist as a bad prejudice or an authentic judgment. One is the lack of need for that social trust, which is a defining characteristic of healthy prejudice, which is to say that healthy prejudice, she says, is necessary because collecting data to solve certain problems is simply too laborious. And so we must trust other people to some degree who have done that footwork for us. And I think that the data embedded in the question, is the Holocaust bad or is slavery bad, is a type of data which is not laborious. If you will, it reveals itself to you right away. And it demands of you a judgment. So these things can only be held as judgments or as prejudices which are masquerading as judgments, and those are clearly bad. It cannot be a trusting social thing. The nature of the question is different. And I think she gets to that later on the next page. It says, within the social realm, however, we do not make any claim to judge, and our waiving of that claim, our substitution of prejudice for judgment, becomes dangerous only if it spreads into the political arena. The category of things that I'm talking about, which cannot exist as healthy prejudices, would have as one characteristic a sort of inherent political nature, so that you cannot confine it to the social realm. It's impossible. Again, it appears as something inherently political, which demands of you a judgment. And yeah, I guess for children, so there can be cases where you allow for a superficial prejudice, but that's only ever a temporary sort of thing.
So let's just talk about some social prejudices, right? And it's always hard because we're trying to not say things we don't want to say. So I'm going to use examples. I hope they work. We create a chess club and we only let in people who like chess. And maybe we only let in, let's be a little bit more, we only let in men who play chess. We'll be a little bit more provocative. Okay. From Arendt's point of view, there's prejudices in that, and they're perfectly fine on a social level. So you should call them genuine prejudices or healthy. You're using the word healthy. I don't know if there's a difference, but okay. But she says that's fine on a social level, but it's not if you then bleed it into the political reign and only let in chess players who are men to be citizens or congressmen or senators. So I think the difference in the social and the political is simply, that prejudices that make these kind of distinctions, which are part of social life, aren't supposed to be brought into politics. I don't think there's different kinds of things that can be. I don't think the prejudice against women chess players or non-chess players is different in a way than the prejudice against people who don't like Jews. I don't think that there's a standard criteria for that difference. They're both based in prejudices. They may be wrong. One might be one we are more sympathetic to than the other. But either one of those prejudices is not allowed in the public realm, not just the one we don't like. And, so I was using the Holocaust is bad and slavery is bad because I'm trying to use prejudices that we generally accept. And it's hard to do that. And so I'm trying to be somewhat politically non-confrontational. I could use more confrontational and more controversial prejudices. I'm hesitant to do so in a recorded session online. But you know, if we were to say, I'm, you know, that we have a prejudice against people with IQs under a certain amount, right? You know, again, from her point of view in the social world, that's okay. We can decide who we want to hang out with. But it's not okay in the political world. And that's still a genuine prejudice. So what am I missing, Andrew? I'm not sure if I'm not sure what it is that I'm missing in your question.
I'm not sure either, and I don't want to take up too much time. It really did come from a swirl of thoughts, and maybe I'm not making entirely a lot of sense, but I'm very interested in this idea that a prejudice, a genuine prejudice, does not masquerade itself as judgment. I think that's a super interesting idea, and I think that a statement like the Holocaust is bad, it's difficult, when I make it, I mean it as a judgment, and I think it's difficult to imagine that statement being made with the self-awareness of someone who knows that they are using a convenient, genuine prejudice. And so that was a hint to me that there was something different by nature, if you want, in the type of question. But you know, it's just, for me, it's a new idea, and
I think it's a fascinating point that you just brought up. Is you said you use the Holocaust as bad as a judgment, not as a prejudice, and you know, and I have no idea what your background is. You may be a Holocaust scholar, or even if you're not, you may know a lot about it. And I understand. So I understand why you're saying that. And yet I think about it this way. It's almost impossible in public discourse to utter the other side, right? The Holocaust was good. Mm-hmm. That suggests that it's a prejudice and not a judgment. That even if in my case or your case or someone's case, it's based on a kind of personal experience and knowledge and thought, there's almost no other option. And in that case, it's a kind of, well, maybe it could be the kind of things where it's both in certain people. But that's what I think makes it interesting in that way. Okay. At least, look, it's a great question. I you know, and it's one that we need to talk more about, and I wish I had more time. Yeah. But write me about it.
Thank you. That last thing was helpful, and I do have the feeling that we have some things that are stacked. And again, there's some great distinctions being drawn, but maybe some of these things are actually kind of stacked sometimes. But okay. I'm signing off. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Hal, you get the last question.
Yeah, no, mine was about the role of, because one thing that we don't really have, you were mentioning how standards are breaking down, and what would then Arendt say about the role of the media in establishing standards, if there's any role in establishing standards? Because the media is at once, it's not really an individual, but it plays such a role in both creating a public sphere, but as well as like acting as an actor in the public sphere, in the sense that the New York Times, assuming, I mean, maybe I'm even being antiquated here, hoping that something that the New York Times would have a set of facts that it would agree with. But like the New York Times or some other newspaper trusted by a lot of people puts out a statement of fact, or what it believes to be a statement or which journalists have seen. And then there are other magazines that publish opinions on that, or maybe even parts within the New York Times doing that. What would Arendt say about that? The idea that because the media both creates a public sphere in a certain way, especially something like Facebook, but also acts, especially even Facebook, like, okay, Facebook sometimes makes editorial judgments. They take down posts which are like or something like that.
So, you know, in the last section of her essay, Truth and Politics, right? Arendt says that one of the things that we learn is that in order for us to do politics, we need certain standards and realms outside of politics. And she mentions a couple of them, right? One is the academy, right? Which is supposed to be a nonpartisan search for truth. Another is journalism, she says, which is supposed to present the facts. And insofar as the academy and the press remain apolitical and are governed by certain criteria and standards, you know, her hope is that they provide a kind of non-political, outside, extra-political place for standards to emerge that then become the ground on which we do politics. But she is already worried, writing in the 1960s, that both the press and the academy are becoming politicized in ways that are destructive of their authorities and their abilities to be non-political places for these standards to emerge. And so I think she thinks what you're saying is very important, that the press and the academy in her mind should remain outside of politics. But I think it's in our time, it's something that largely hasn't happened.
But what about like things that are like, I mean, obviously opinion essays and editorials existed way before, like, I mean, she writes about the Dreyfus affair and Origins of Totalitarianism. Like, how can those, obviously those are political things. I'm pretty sure she isn't saying there shouldn't be editorials or anything like that.
No, but there should be a distinction between editorials and news, right? Just like there's, you know, there. I mean, I use this example because I think it means a lot. You know, I'm very concerned with climate change, as are many of my colleagues and friends. And one of the, I think, real drawbacks, or one of the reasons that's hurt the climate change movement, is that a lot of climate scientists have gotten involved politically. And I've talked to some of them, sometimes in public once, and we had an interesting debate at a talk he gave. And I said, you know, the fact that you're out here advocating for certain rules on climate change undercuts your authority as a scientist. And, you know, he was very adamant that scientists can't simply do science anymore. They have to become advocates. It's too important. And from an Arendtian point of view, as a citizen, you can always, of course, vote and do politics. But if you invoke your authority as a scientist for political reasons, you politicize your position and you undercut your authority. And, you know, the fact that now, unfortunately, a number of leading climate change scientists have been caught in emails and other things, fudging the data or trying to make the data more, you know, more palatable to public consumption to make their case better, has set, I think, the movement for climate change, you know, for climate change policy back, because it showed the science to be confused with advocacy. And I think that's a huge incentive that all of us as academics have to move from, you know, like there's a lot of people who want me to use Arendt to argue for or against certain politics, whether it's Trump or someone else. And, you know, what I've tried to do in this reading group and in other public things is to read Arendt and use Arendt to formulate questions about where we are, but not provide answers. If I were to come out as the head of the Hannah Arendt Center and say, you know, this is what we should do, I mean, no one would listen, doesn't matter. But, you know, I would, I think, be, you know, a lot of people think that's what I should do as a citizen, because they think you know, we're in a crisis and people have to stand up. But I think it would be sullying not only her reputation, but the very idea of what she understands academics and intellectual work to be, which is about thinking and raising questions in the pursuit of understanding and meaning, and not in policy. And that's why the Arendt Center doesn't get involved in policy issues. We never have, for that reason. And I know a lot of people want us to. I get criticized for that all the time from people, but that's where that's the basis for why we stick to where we are. Okay. Thank you all. Have a great holiday season, whatever Christmas, Kwanzaa, Christmas, Hanukkah, New Year you celebrate. We'll see you on January 8th in the new year, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much.